Talk about prevarication. I answered every email that needed answered and made all the phone calls necessary and unnecessary, cleaned the kitchen, washed the floors, saw some moving wallpaper on television before I finally forced myself to sit down and write about today's events. And I knew why I was doing it. I was angry at once again finding myself witnessing the further erosion of our precious democratic values by the very government departments that are supposed to be protecting and upholding them. The sad thing is that this is no longer an isolated incident or a one-off failure and process. It is much part of a bigger pattern that people right across Northern Ireland have been watching develop for years now. Little by little, public confidence in our civil service has been chipped away through lobbying, political influence, the growing power of large corporations, and a system that seems more comfortable accommodating big business than listening to ordinary communities. You start to notice that scrutiny becomes weaker, difficult questions become inconvenient, and people with genuine expertise like Doug Hill can find themselves pushed to the margins when what they are saying no longer fits neatly into the direction things are moving. For me, it feels like a race to the bottom in public life, where democratic safeguards are slowly hollowed out and trust in institutions becomes harder and harder to hold on to. An extraordinary moment in the roads inquiry occurred today when retired senior roads engineer Doug Hill, a man with roughly 45 years' experience delivering and assessing major road and infrastructure projects across the North, effectively warned the Commission that the process itself is neither compliant nor robust enough to safely proceed. Doug's concern was that critical engineering safety and procedural issues around the proposed abandonment of the road were not being properly interrogated or independently scrutinised. He wanted to raise concerns about road safety, visibility, drainage, heavy vehicles, movements, long-term maintenance liabilities, emergency access, and even the legality and adequacy of the road abandonment procedures themselves. Instead of these warnings triggering deeper examination, Doug was effectively shut out of the process after challenging the procedure being used. In other words, one of the most experienced road engineers in Northern Ireland attempted to formally raise concerns that the inquiry itself is not following a sufficiently robust or compliant process, and rather than opening that discussion up, the system appeared to close ranks around it. After a heated exchange between Doug and the commissioners, he voluntarily excluded himself from the room, disgusted that his stand for engineering integrity and his concern for risk and public safety were being totally disregarded. He did this as the Commissioner was reading out the Riot Act that is used to exclude people from the inquiry, and also seems to trigger simultaneously call for police help, because within 10 minutes, 2 policemen also appeared. How I wish they were as quick to appear when community needs urgent help. However, that topic is for a different day. I'm guessing the system has them on speed dial. It wouldn't be for the first time. Whilst I admit that Doug was noisy and maybe not as polite as he might have been, I do think it could have been handled differently. You can imagine the headlines either now or perhaps in the future after a fatal accident. Safety questions raised as senior road engineer shut out of inquiry, or the day road safety concerns were pushed aside, and so on. Doug Hill today effectively became the whistleblower around this shambolic public inquiry, and the establishment did not respond well. They say that being seen as authentic is the most valuable crown of the realm, but having integrity around your authenticity is quite a different proposition. Not only is Doug Hill a whistleblower, but he's also a stand for compliance and duty of candour, which Cormac McAleer has constantly highlighted the glaring absence of almost every day during this inquiry. But I think hurt Doug most was not simply the technical deficiencies or the procedural concerns. Doug is a man who spent the greater part of his life working within a system that was built around standards, compliance, public safety and professional integrity. And as an aside, if you check out the podcast notes, you can see a list of his professional achievements. Those values are more than his job. They're literally a part of his identity. And when someone's identity feels compromised, something very deep is touched in the human psychic. Sitting in that room, you could sense the weight of realising that many of the principles he had spent decades defending now seemed to be slowly diluted, negotiated away, or treated as obstacles to be managed. I also think there was a hurt in watching former colleagues and institutions he once respected and believed in appearing willing to accept standards that years ago would simply have never passed without challenge. It was a moment of genuine distress, and he was a man who had reached the limits of his professional frustration. You could feel the quiet and heavy disappointment in him. To abandon a public road for the benefit of a private gold mine, while fundamental concerns around process, safety and accountability remain unresolved, risks becoming an erosion of democracy itself. Shame on DFI, shame on the planning appeals process. If on your watch the quality of public infrastructure is compromised, safety is surrendered, risk increase solely to accommodate a private commercial company, all while communities are excluded from meaningful decision-making. And maybe this realisation is exactly the point where systems, either institutions, begin to recover themselves or continue sliding further away from the public interest altogether. Which brings me neatly to tonight's very special recruitment opportunity. Unfortunately, it's only open to DFI or PAC employees. The role is for a full-time DFI or PAC whistleblower. Now, I should say from the outset, applicants would need to be highly motivated because the package on offer is frankly terrible. There's no salary attached to the role. In fact, there's a reasonable chance you'll lose the salary you have. Pension possibly gone, career finished. You may be isolated, quietly disappeared, talked about in corridors, avoided at conferences, and suddenly find yourself no longer invited for tea and biscuits in the staff room. And candidates should also be comfortable with prolonged levels of stress, mild paranoia, and the possibility of becoming that person who made things awkward by insisting on standards, compliance, integrity, and duty of candour. However, there are a few benefits. Successful applicants will receive the undying gratitude of a small rural community in the Sperrins. There's also a strong possibility of getting into heaven, or at the very least, avoiding a very uncomfortable conversation at the pearly gates about DFI compliance agreements. You will also enjoy the rare personal satisfaction of being able to look yourself in the mirror and say, "At least I tried," which these days is becoming a surprisingly valuable thing. There's also honour, a certain amount of glory, maybe not immediately, possibly not even while you're alive, but definitely the sort of quiet reputation that lasts a lot longer than a consultancy contract or an internal memo. So if you are currently sitting somewhere trapped inside these systems, staring into the middle distance, wondering what on earth has happened to the standards you once believed in, our lines are open. And to finish this evening, I have one final thought. As far as I'm concerned, Doug Hill's response was the only thing that mattered today. Because when a man who has spent 45 years building, assessing and safeguarding public roads stands up in obvious distress and effectively warns that the process itself is failing basic standards of scrutiny, compliance and integrity, then the entire inquiry should have stopped there and then in its tracks. Instead, It just rolled on. And from that moment on, everything else I heard in the rule today felt diminished by it. I'll see you all tomorrow.